Sonido Software presents Story of a Studio, where we meet with recording studio owners and audio professionals, hear of their passions, and share their unique stories with you. Hey, this is Brady Hogard with Sonido Software. Today we are meeting with Steve Comeau with Bass Lab Studio. So Steve, very excited to be here. You have an incredibly unique studio space.
Trying to build a good sounding room in an extra wide shipping container is definitely not without its challenges. This is built in extra wide, 10.5 foot wide by 25 foot shipping container, and it presented quite a list of challenges trying to get something like this in this room and get it to be functional.
Sure. I can imagine. I definitely want to dive into that here in a little bit and get to know your studio space. But, before we get there, I'd love to rewind a little bit and hear about you. Hear about, early stages of Steve. How did you build passion around audio? What got you interested in getting into the audio industry?
Well, I grew up in a place called Halifax, Nova Scotia, which is on the east coast of Canada. And I started getting into bands at age 16, 17, and just through necessity, ended up learning how to do basic recording and things for the musical projects that I was in. There was a local sort of sound or audio art co-op called the Center for Art Tapes, and I sort of hooked up with them at 17, and through working with them, sort of got my feet wet and learned the basic skills of being an audio engineer and a producer. And then from there, I ended up opening up one of Halifax's first 24-track recording studios in about 1992, and ran with that for a few years. And then sort of got sidetracked for a little while doing television production. And then around 2007, I think it was, I decided to get back into music. And when that happened, I didn't have any sort of proper space or technology or anything, and technology had really changed since the mid-90s. And that's when I sort of had to equip myself with the skills to learn how to design a room, proper acoustics, what the state of the art with digital technologies were and things like that. And that sort of carried on through. In 2011, I moved to Salt Lake and continued to sort of pursue my passion with music. And it just so happens that, various opportunities opened up not only for me to work as an engineer, as a producer, but I've actually sort of designed and built a few studios for other people.
That's great. Yeah. We'll talk about that. That's terrific. So going back, your first studio that you built out, a 24-track studio, about how old were you when you built that first studio?
22, 23.
Okay.
Yeah.
Tell us about that experience. I mean, what did you learn from, you'd been learning engineering through your experience in Nova Scotia, but building your first studio and running that as a business, what did you learn?
Oh, I learned a lot of lessons. It's a hard racket regardless of where you're at. The big lesson for me was that you sort of have to manage what you do, or something you've had as a passion that you've turned into a business will quickly turn into drudgery and you'll lose all your passion for it. So the big lesson I walked away from that first studio was having to work with every band that came through the door or take advantage of every opportunity that appeared very quickly destroyed my sort of love of the process and my love of the art. And it took a little while to recover from that. So now when I build studios like this, I don't put myself in a position where I'm financially dependent on them, for sort of my own sustenance. And it allows me to be much more selective with who I work with to ensure that I don't experience a high level of burnout or, have what I do, which I love, turn into drudgery.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So how many years did you have that first studio?
3 or 4.
3 or 4, okay. So in the 90s, what was the music scene like there in Nova Scotia? Was it getting into grunge, or was that...
Yeah, Halifax was called the Seattle of the East for many years.
Okay.
There was bands like Sloan and Plum Tree. And it was I do feel quite privileged having had the opportunity to grow up in that music scene, because even for a small city of 250,000 people, it was a very vibrant and fantastic scene, and there was a real camaraderie or family-like vibe amongst musicians in that city, sort of regardless of the genre that you were playing or creating in.
That's terrific. That's really neat. So fast forward a little bit, you talked a little bit about the changes, obviously, coming from, the early 90s into the 2000s, technology, things started to change. What were some of the biggest challenges that you went through in your audio production career with those technology changes, or did it come easy to you?
I wouldn't say it was necessarily challenge learning the new technology. I found that the new technology didn't allow you to sort of fudge things the way you were with systems that were not as true or didn't sound as good. So when I got back into it and things were all being done in workstations, DAWs with plugins and all that, it really required me to up my game significantly because the quality was there, and I had to sort of match that quality skill-wise. Mm-hmm. So that was probably the big challenge, and that's sort of the challenge all along. I've been at this for 35 years, and it's one of those things that only now do I feel like I've actually gotten to the point where I'm doing work that I'm happy with.
Really? Yeah.
So it takes a long while to train your ears and to develop your understanding and get to the point. And it's an ongoing process. It's not like I think I'm at a plateau and won't get better. I think I'll just continue to learn as long as I do this.
Yeah. I think that's true for a lot of audio professionals, right? Over time, you think you're doing well, and then you listen back and say, "Man, I didn't know what I didn't know." And it's such a learning process, and that's great that you've stuck with it for so long. Okay, so we're sitting in your studio space. Uh-huh. Very, very cool space. Bass Lab Studio. Tell us a little bit about how this came about, how long you've been in business here, and where does the name come from?
Well, to me, one of the most difficult things to get right, regardless of the genre of music you do, is the low end. And because I do a lot of electronic music, the low end is of supreme importance. Mm-hmm. Designing rooms, studios that have good low end response, where you can hear the low end, is sort of the biggest acoustical challenge. Higher frequencies are easily addressed via absorption, but the low and the sub-low is all math, structure, a much higher level of sort of challenge involved. So I call it Bass Lab because all the studios I've built, the struggle has been to get a room that has really fantastic bass response, so that the bass isn't too heavy, so you end up making your mixes light, mm-hmm. or the bass is too light and you're making your mixes heavy. Yeah. So to me, that is the greatest challenge in designing any studio or control room, is getting the low end right. So that's why it's called Bass Lab.
That's neat. That's really terrific. What have you done in your studio space to build a better environment for the low end, or better treat the space for the low end?
There's only so much you can do with a sort of shitty metal box that's 10 by 25 feet, but on the rear wall of the studio there's 3 feet of Owens Corning 705 behind all that acoustic treatment, and on the other side there's a foot of 705, and I deliberately replaced the steel doors of this container on either end and replaced it with wood so that there is a bit of transference and not as much of a sort of hard reflection of the super low. And the ceiling is 4 inches of 705 with a 6-inch gap. So the entire ceiling of this place is one giant bass trap.
Okay. Uh-huh.
And then wherever I could, I put as much absorption in as possible.
Yeah. Well, and your experience in designing studios. So how many have you designed? What number is this?
I think this is number 6.
Okay. Okay. Talk to us about that experience, from the first that you started building out and how, what has your experience been in building out these studio spaces?
I find them interesting challenges. The idea of creating a space that is not only sort of technically sound from the perspective of, the frequency response to the room and being a decent room to work in, as well as being sort of aesthetically pleasing. And what happened was, the first studio I made was way back in the day when I said I was in Halifax, and I helped this arts co-op build a new studio, and I learned a lot from that process. And then, every time you build a room, you build a studio, you learn a lot, and you sort of have to live with the flaws and the mistakes you've made. And because of that, it sort of just encouraged me to sort of undertake a never-ending sort of process of learning with each room. Luckily, I've had the opportunity to work with some interesting people. Ethan Warner, the guy who founded Real Traps on a couple projects, has been a huge resource, and I've been very honored and flattered that he will pick up the phone anytime I call and run some crazy idea by him, for any of these different studios that I've built. Mm-hmm. So he's taught me a lot, and I've read a lot, and it's just sort of trial and error with a bunch of other stuff.
That's great. That's terrific. So as far as your services here with Bass Lab Studio,
yep.
You're doing audio,
yep.
You do mixing, you do mastering. Mm-hmm. What other services do you offer through the studio?
I also have experience as a video post-production person. I did a lot of that when I was in art school, and since then I've set this place up as a post facility with DaVinci Resolve, and I'm doing a lot of video post color correction here as well as audio. Okay.
Well, and thinking about the industry today, with audio production, it's always evolving. It's always been changing, right?
Yeah.
But how do you feel? How important is it for engineers and producers to, cross those boundaries? They do audio. Is it important for them to learn about video as well these days, or?
I don't know it's necessarily important. I think that a lot of the skills and the sort of intellectual processes are very similar. For instance, I just got into color grading video footage, and it's very analogous to mastering audio in the sense that, you have to have a calibrated monitor, and you have to develop a sense of what, looks good and what doesn't, in the same way you train your ears mastering to understand what is good or not. And plus there's the certain aesthetic choices you make based on the media you're working with or the particular project. Mm-hmm. And I found learning color grading as a part of video post, like I say, is almost the exact same mindset as mastering audio.
Wow. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
That's
but
neat.
If you don't have interest in video, I don't see there necessarily being an upside to incorporating video into your business unless it's sort of a natural fit, because it's a whole world, a whole new market, whole new community, whole new set of skills that unless there's some very clear and direct benefit, I don't see how it would augment most conventional studios.
Yeah.
Although if you're lucky enough to do sound for picture or composition for picture, that is definitely a much more direct tie-in between a conventional audio studio and some sort of video production process.
You bet. Well, that's great. I appreciate that that feedback. So tell me now, this is something that is a focal point in your studio, and something I just wanted to address. You've got your desk, not the traditional chair and tall studio desk. Tell me about. We're sitting on cushions. We're looking at a desk that's about 12 to 18 inches off the ground. Tell me about your environment here. What do you like about the setup, or why did you intentionally design your space this way?
Well, I like to joke that it just means there's less distance for me to fall when I've had too much whiskey. But there's an acoustic reason for it, and that is, in any room, the absolute worst listening position is halfway between two surfaces. So we adjust for this on this axis because we need a consistent stereo image left to right. But the other axes, you want to avoid being in the exact center. And by having this, my ear is far removed from the midpoint between the physical barrier, the ceiling, and the floor, and it just produces a better sort of acoustic result. If you think of most rooms, the ceilings are 8 feet tall or whatever. When you sit in your chair, your ear is almost directly at the midpoint of the vertical axes, and that's not the most optimum listening position. Mm-hmm. I also find this very comfortable to work in, having the meditation cushions and sort of keeping everything low to the floor.
That's terrific. Well, you have a very beautiful space.
Thank you.
Seems like it's very, very functional and very suitable for you and your personality and all that you've put into the studio space. So really appreciate you letting me come by and visit Bass Lab Studio. And we wish you the very best in all that you do, and can't wait to hear more of your work as it's produced and comes out.
Excellent. Yeah, thanks for coming by and giving me the opportunity to sort of show people what we got going on here.